is said to have evolved as a response to rising inequality. So it is related in some level to
Actually, I'm
social
in
reform.
conference.
Preventive and social medicine, as Apurva also pointed out, has evolved as
नहीं नहीं
sanitation
हमारे
and
सेंटर क्या
hygiene,
है?
then germ theory evolved. Community medicine at this point looks majorly at health services for communities. Of course, there are other aspects that it takes into consideration, such as prevention of diseases, which again shows us that there is an overlap between, if we look at preventive and social
You're
medicine
looking
and
great.
community medicine. And as such, we'll also find that in institutions, also these are used rather interchangeably. Community health is another term that has been used almost interchangeably, but especially if we look at older literature, but slowly with the focus being on medicine for community medicine and preventive and social medicine, community health also looks at other community-based aspects such as community practices, and even as we find more and more community health workers being involved, that is another aspect that is taken care of in community health. Um, International health history, if we look at, so this is something that came about with colonial medicine, and so it was associated with quarantines and isolation and other such preventive practices which would be used to deal with the health of colonized nations as they would travel across borders. Global health is said to have evolved from international health, as global village kind of a concept has come up through the years. Now, in more recent times, we look at One Health, where interdependence of life forms is something we look into. Planetary health is not only about the focus on human health, but also the impact of human activity on human health and planet. So there is also adaptation and mitigation involved in this. Apurva, if you can shift the slides. Oh, I'm so sorry. I forgot I'd taken. Yeah, I'm really sorry. Yeah. So again, to go a little bit more into it, just looking at the different disciplines and actors that work in all of these, we'll find that there is a considerable overlap. I'm not going into too much detail because I think a lot of these things are already known to many of us, but just a depiction of what it is like. Um, so there are many disciplines which are involved in almost all of these terms. It's not entirely exclusive anywhere. um, a little bit more into that. So if we are trying to see the elements and processes and environment, again, so this is, as you can see, this is the text is tiny because I was trying to fit in everything, and this is of course a work in progress. But if we look at public health, there are so many actors that are involved, there are so many processes that are involved, and there are obviously many overlaps between all of these as well. Just to put the context out there, so while we are thinking of defining the contours of public health, there are some commonalities that we see in all of these terms. Nearly all of these terms seem to think of communities or slightly different units of populations, essentially different. But at the same time, they are looking at populations' health. There is systems thinking involved where several interlinkages are explored in all of these fields. There is interdisciplinarity in all of these, but we obviously, as we saw, there is a difference in which fields are focused on, which fields focus on which kinds of actors, which is why we are hoping to explore further today with our esteemed guests, how to explore all of these factors and the paradigms in which these have evolved. And we also need to look at all of these fields in the sense of as they are evolving, they're still evolving. It's not that we've stopped, these changes have stopped in all of these fields. So over to you, Ritupriya ma'am.
Thank you, Apurva and Shivangi. That very briefly laid out the complex field of the discipline itself, and probably reminded many of us of some dimensions and pointed out the complexity of it, and therefore the issue of looking at the contours of public health even today. I now request the chair to be taken over by Dr. Jayaprakash Mulyal. He really needs no introduction to this audience, and yet I'll do that formal introduction very briefly. Dr. Jayaprakash Mulyal completed his undergraduate studies in medicine and PG studies in community medicine from Christian Medical College, Vellore, and joined the faculty there. He was in charge of the leprosy program, very specifically in their community health and development, the CHAD program, covering a population of 1 lakh. He then went to Johns Hopkins University to complete his MPH and DRPH in epidemiology. He became a professor of community medicine in 1990 and started the first formal course in epidemiology at CMC Vellore in 1992. From 2002, he served as a 5-year term as the principal of the CMC Vellore and has closely worked with the Government of India on various projects and been a member of scientific advisory and strategic committees of national and international institutions. He has published over 175 papers in international and national journals. So over to you, Professor Mulyal. We look forward to hearing your words of wisdom and perspective on this very issue.
Thank you, Ritu. I hope I am audible and visible.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes.
A few years ago, Sir Jeremy Farrar.
Newspaper. No. Library से लिया.
Can others please mute themselves? Can all others, other than the speaker, please
mute them from central this thing?
Yeah, and can the host please mute them?
चाय पीने जा रहे हो?
Professor Mulyal, I would request you to unmute, please.
Hello.
I am unmuted.
No, sir, because I have to mute everyone. I had to mute everyone centrally. So I would request you to unmute. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yes, good. A few years ago, Sir Jeremy Farrar, who is now the chief scientific executive of WHO, visited Vellore. He didn't come to see me. He came to see Dr. Gagandeep Khan, and we had a conversation. During the conversation, every time I mentioned the word community health, he would correct me to public health. So it went on during our little game till he was there in Vellore. But the point is, these words have always confused people. I just want to express my grateful thanks to Apurva and Shivagni for delving into it and clarifying the matter. I'm grateful to the honor to present Imrana Kadir to you, who will be our first speaker. She did have undergraduate and postgraduate training in pediatrics at King George Medical College, Patna, and then moved to All India Institute of Medical Sciences, a pediatric. He then moved to Jawaharlal Nehru University Center for Social Medicine and Community Health in 1971 as faculty and retired as a professor in 2006. She was J.P. Nayak, a senior fellow at CWDS and later distinguished professor of Council for Social Development. At present, she works independently as a well-known public health scholar and author. Over the years, building the scaffolding for a different kind of coursework in public health through interdisciplinary approach has been the challenge that engaged her most. This meant developing social epidemiology, interdisciplinary research methodology, drawing heavily upon social sciences, theory to conceptualize problems for political economy of public health and its social determinants, and their role in health planning and organization of public health. Welcome, Dr. Imrana. Over to you.
Good evening to everyone. I hope I'm audible. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
Yeah. So it's always good to be back on this platform. And many thanks to the organizer, to Professor Krishnan, to Ritupriya, and all those who are behind you. And thanks to the two young presenters. And many thanks to Professor Mulial, whose work we all admire so much, because he's been one of the leading thinkers in public health. To the young ones who initiated this debate, I would just like to point out two things. Very interesting listening to you. But you know, you present the evolution as a very homogeneous evolutionary process. Everyone is wanting the good of human beings, and it's a linear evolution. I think we need to kind of be a little more careful. And I think we need to take on two things. One, that remember the term social medicine evolved during the French Revolution. And it was the people who were fighting for better conditions of life. The term preventive and social medicine has a very interesting history because public health was the terminology. In 17th, 18th century, but it was very limited. But what happened was that many movements started behind this term also. If you read the history of movements, you will see that there was a British movement for welfare in which, you know, the liberals were in the forefront, like Bevan, like Beveridge. But there were also the Chartist movement, the movement of the working people of Britain fighting for their rights. So these terms of social medicine, community health, public health, they moved, they traveled, and they went to the US. And what is interesting is that while in the early 20th century, there was an effort, but later on, what happened was that given the politics and the political domain, the ideological choices that the United States made, welfare for each and every individual was not the main thrust. And therefore, social medicine within the academic institutions was contained within community medicine. And this meant that the medical students were taught about the relationship, but within smaller communities and not amongst populations. And therefore, we need to use the term people and populations and community health very carefully, because people are stratified, sometimes contrary interests against each other, whereas communities are defined sociologically as homogeneous communities, which is not necessarily the case. Now, with this, I would like to then say that if we are talking of the borders of the public health system, then obviously I want to begin with my vision of the system, a complexity which consists of maybe subsystems, and each subsystem consisting of many elements. And these are working together despite internal contradictions towards a common objective. But the interesting thing is that the outcome depends upon the interlinkages and the relationships between the elements and the subsystems, and over time they may change. The nature of elements change, the nature of relationships change, and very often even objectives change. And therefore, this complexity has to be handled very gently. Public health system, as I understand it, has public, the people, at the center, at the core of it. And if you want to draw on a paper, I would draw concentric circles, one around the other. And the people are in every center. They are the ones who are healthy, they are the ones who are sick, they are the ones who are seeking help, they are the ones who are providing, they are the ones who are planning, and they are the ones who are controlling. And they're also the ones who are creating different types of medical systems. The traditional systems all across the globe and the modern medicine, which again has a very contradictory relationship with traditional systems. So I would say that I will put in this sea of people, medical care, medical treatment of individuals as the starting point, because that's how medicine started historically, and then medical care systems, institutionalization of medical care through clinics, through hospitals, through institutions of different kinds. And then the healthcare system. The term medicine then gets replaced by health conceptually for me, because health is broader than medical care. And this healthcare system then becomes the comprehensive healthcare system, because this is embedded in the socio-economic and cultural political system of a people, a country, or a nation, as you would like to call it. So the health service system is embedded in the socio-economic and political system. And I would like to underline that terms like One Health, like planetary health, are considered something new, a new emerging direction. But I believe that if you read the traditional texts of public health, this relationship of man, disease, animals, ecology, and environment has always been there. See, what is happening is that if you understand the politics of the system, the political economic system, the system of productions that the world has created for itself, it creates more and more damage to people. It creates more and more destruction of the environment. And then we push public health to deal with each one of those. And we say that our horizons are increasing, but we never go back to the core, which I believe is the political economy of health, which is the need to ensure that every unit in every strata of people gets its basic needs fulfilled. And how do you organize societies to reach that goal? For this, nations organize, and we call ourselves democracies. And we say that we are going to ensure the rights of the people. And interestingly enough, very often you read different countries and see how differently organized societies, countries have different schema of public health. So within this domain, I would like to add two more things. One is that it's not only the socioeconomic, cultural context of the society in which we work and live, which we need to understand, but also the governments which regulate these and the international context. So you can see that from the core, which is essentially biomedical, the medical care system and clinical medicine, we expand into community health systems and comprehensive health systems that Alma Ata introduced, and there's a history to it also. And then how governments ensure that we either get these or we don't get these. Now, I will draw your attention to some of the definitions of public health that we have, starting with the first definition that I can think of, somewhere in the late 19th and early 20th century, Winslow, who defined public health as the science and art of preventing diseases, prolonging life, promoting health of the community through organized community efforts. This calls for organization of healthcare services, manpower, technology, and material for the early diagnosis, prevention, and treatment of the disease. Please note, the development of social machinery which will ensure access to service, environmental sanitation, health education to community, and a standard of living which is adequate to maintain health. So organizing these benefits as to enable every citizen to realize right to health. Now imagine that as early as the 19th century, you had this definition, which has been ignored. About 80, 90 years later, the American experts from the Institute of Medicine redefined public health, which to them means addressing public interest in health by applying scientific and technical knowledge to prevent disease and promote health. And today, the World Health Organization defines public health as organized means, whether public or private. Please note, whether public or private, to prevent disease, promote health, prolong life, etc., etc. Now you can see that from socially embedded public health of Winslow, we move to a technocentric approach of the American definition, and then the WHO finally says that it's not just the state, it's not just the collective responsibility, the private sector also has a role to play. Now, obviously then you can see that there is a history and politics to definitions and to nomenclatures. And I think it's very important to understand that. And as our young colleagues have shown us, we need an approach which is interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary, and we need to understand the complexity of public health, because it is not a closed system. It is not a system which always produces the same outcome. It is a breathing, changing, dynamic system, and its boundaries are determined by the politics of a country. So you see that from the liberal era, where people like Wishaw, people like Winslow, they could think in broader terms. We moved to a more technocentric system in today's world. Today, when from liberalism, we have moved into neoliberalism, where welfare for health is not considered that critical, because we have so much technology that technology is going to give us all the answers. So, keeping that in mind, I don't want to make my presentation boring and theoretical. So I would like to share the story of how I learned about public health and how my journey was a collective journey with my colleagues, and how we have taken so long, a lot of time, interaction, fighting with each other, debating with each other, listening to each other, and having to understand that sometimes we have to retract our ideas, sometimes we have to reject our ideas and accommodate other ideas. And that interdisciplinarity is not just bringing disciplines together. Interdisciplinarity means that you have a problem, and to understand that, you use concepts that help you understand. Be they from sociology, anthropology, biomedicine, clinical medicine, wherever. But the objective is to understand the problem. To do this, I would begin by the kind of work that we did at the center. And we generated this debate. It was through Dr. Banerjee and his work, which we all were involved in, the study of the 19 villages, which he published also later as Caste, Class, Poverty and Health, that I, as a pediatrician, coming very raw from a medical environment, began to see the importance of understanding caste, class, gender, religion, ethnicity, what it is. Because these are the stratifications that operate in our society. They combine in different ways to create subgroups which develop relationships, working relationships, social relationships, cultural relationships, and that determines health. Ritu did some interesting work. She disappeared with the migrants, the Rajasthani migrants, into villages, and then she would come back after some time and she'll tell you what she has done. And her published work brings out to me such an enlightening insight, wherein she says that for the poor and for the common man, health is not just physical health. Health means dignity and health means respect. I think I've learned this from Ritu and I'm really grateful. You know, in our interactions, here Nair, our previous colleague, he was here. One day in our debates, he was very angry and he said that you people only borrow theory from social sciences and you are only biomedical people, you have no theory. And at that time, of course, we were all very angry and we were fighting. But later on, I began thinking, and I think he's right. It's only borrowing from social sciences that has enriched public health. The work that Rama did in the center, you know, she has worked on privatization in India. One of the earliest researchers that were published in this piece, and she argues how what is the social background of those who are getting into privatization, and she's showing how the nursing home owners were first the NRIs coming with their collected dollars and investing and opening up these, and how over time this has changed into the rich peasantry of Andhra and Maharashtra growing sugar cane and cotton. They have shifted their capital into health industry, and they are the ones who are largely responsible for creating these huge, big corporate sector hospitals. So the linkages were so interesting. I can go on narrating Rajiv's work on cholera, where he's showing us we blame the poor always for being unclean, unhealthy, not understanding. And he says that amongst the poor sections, the water is polluted at source. We talk of high levels of mental problems, and especially depressions among women in India, and we publish papers. And here is Ramila, who worked in the mountains to show us how hard the women work, how much is the responsibility that they carry on their shoulders, because the men have migrated and they have to do everything. Let the land flourish, let the children grow, look after the older people, and they suffer from stress, they suffer from depression. So the answer is not pills. The answer lies in social strategies. So I'm sorry, I'm not going to talk of all the work of everyone, but this is just to show you that how we were discovering the linkages between society, social factors, and health. And we were interacting at that point of time with policy makers, planning commission, and there was a ethos wherein you could see that things are possible. But over 70s, things were good. Mid-80s, 90s, everything changed. We had structural reforms, and with that came the health sector reforms. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of the health sector reform, because that will take me into another direction. But the important thing to remember is that the reforms, as they came, actually altered the structure of health service system. The nature of reforms were withdrawal of resources, entry of private sector in private capital into public sector, expansion of the private sector, growth of PPPs, emergence of corporate sector, insurances, and what have you. And this led to fragmentation of the system. In the name of decentralization, it was broken and given autonomy, and you generate your resources. And that means that you will do that service which gives you money. So the priorities change. The priorities change. And we shifted from care to coverage, because the private sector will cover, but you have to pay for it. And when a lot of criticism came up, then they said, okay, we will have social insurances from the state, and the state level social insurances came, PMJY came. So you can see that the structure changed, and structurally the support at the political level was absolutely for the private sector. I mean, it's very interesting that, we blame the public sector for being inadequate, poor quality, not performing, which is all true. But the point is, how is it that till the 70s, when the NRSM was really working well, we were doing better? And how is it that we have now suddenly degenerated? It's obviously, if you don't give them a level playing field, if you don't invest, if you don't encourage them to compete as they ought to, then the public sector will degenerate. Now, this has led to what? The welfare component of public health retracted, and the boundaries also retracted. So you can see that from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, when we were talking of community health worker, of medical reorientation of medical education, and primary health care, alma mater, all that is now gone, and the boundaries have shrunk. Now, this shrinking, why is it there? Why is this shrinking happening? Now, I believe that it is not just the international pressure of reforms of World Bank and IMF, or the new entrepreneurs like BMJ that is now coming, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, that have a free hold on health. It is also because our policies are following the directives from there. And I say this because what has the government done? We have given up on planning. We have given up on data collection. We gave up on plague monitoring. We gave up on nutrition monitoring. The NSS rounds have not been shared with the people, and even the census has not happened. If you remember the COVID pandemic, we were hailed for the lockdown. And what happened to the vaccines that we produced? They were sold outside, and they were given to the rich who could pay for them, and the poor stayed behind them. And we did not collect adequate data to see what are the side effects, what is happening to people who are complaining. We have a national health account system which gives you great details of public sector investments and keep telling us how out-of-pocket expenditures are falling down. It never talks about the investments made by the private sector. And I say this because if you remember, universal health care, the basic argument was that by incorporating private sector, you are not only increasing your manpower, you're also increasing investments into the health service system and competence. God knows how incompetent we were in the public sector. I will leave that for you. But the point is that this idea that they are bringing in investments, if they are bringing in investment, why the NHA, National Health Accounts, is not estimating? No word. And they say data is not available. But it's very interesting, and we have worked on this and published that if you look at the literature that is coming out from the private sector, it is extremely interesting because they believe that health sector is extremely attractive in India, and there is a big stake because we have a poor population, more disease, we have demographic changes, so more chronic diseases as older people grow. We have cheap labor. So they say these are the they call it the precursors to growth, and growth, of course, of profits and of money. So what I'm trying to say is that it's not just the international influences and pressures, it is our own power interests also. And as far as the international interests go, I will only give you one data, which is that earlier trade, even today, I mean, the US, the GDP that US earns out of arms is fabulous. I have very old figures, I'm not giving it to you. But for the European countries, I have the figures that between 2019 to 2022, from 65 billion euros, they have grown to 1,075 billion euros in medical and pharmaceutical products. So the business of health is the interest. And the business of health means that reforms have to be pushed, commercialization has to push, regulation has to be weakened, and available technologies, mind you, not just technologies, not what technologies we need, but available technologies. And those of you who have read the Lancet Commission of 2013, they have the audacity to say that they in their lifetime will ensure that the third world countries do not suffer. What do we learn from all this? I'm not going into what is the combination of national, international forces. Obviously, it is the culmination of the neo-rich. It is the coming together of the national and international interests. And our learning from this is that a broader definition of public health borders is possible only in a democratic structure, in a social structure which has equal rights, inequality, and justice at the core of its planning, and that these are for everyone. And what happens is that one section overpowers, its interests dominate, and those interests then control policies. And today, that is what is happening in neoliberalism, which is commercialization of health services, undoing of regulations, and thirsting of technologies to create a system which marginalizes the poor And when I talk of the poor, I want to tell you that out of the 1.4 billion people that we have, 11.3 crore are the working people. The middle class is only 30%, and you can have 2-3% of the super rich whose marriages we are watching these days. And this working class, 58% are self-employed. 22% are casual labor or contract laborers. 22% are salaried but not permanent employees. And these are the people who carry the burden of development. So we have this system, the public health system, which expands with democratic social formations and which restricts when liberalism begins to fail and gets into neoliberalism, where the basis of constriction is that earlier capital was invested in countries. There was some productive activities, people were employed. But today, it's not productive units. It's the finances which are moving. They invest and they keep waiting through your ITC. And the moment they find that they can make profit elsewhere, they leave that country and its people to fend for themselves, and the capital moves. And we are left in the lurch. Now, in this extremely difficult situation, we are located together today. I would like to end by saying that we are living in our existential dilemma. We can dream, and we have dreams, and we dreamed in 19th century, and we dreamed in 20th century, and we continue to dream. But we are bound by the limitations of time. We live in a given time, and we all want to do something in that time. So the question is that to expand the boundaries of this system, what is it that you and I want to do? I have some ideas, but I'll stop here because I think I have finished my time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Imrana. That was excellent. And I feel so fortunate I could listen to you today, this evening. I'm going to call upon Kavita. Kavita Shivarakakrishnan is an old friend of mine, or at least I think that is a friend I had many years ago. I haven't met her in the recent past. So for goodness, old time's sake, Kavita, as I introduce you, I hope if there are errors, you will forgive me, because your affiliations are rather confusing. Kavita Sivaramakrishnan is a public health historian of South Asia, and with a focus on politics of health, medicine, and science in Global South. Currently, here is the problem. Associate Professor at the Department of History, Columbia University. But she is also Associate Professor at the Social Medical Science Department of Robert Butler Aging Center, Mailman School of Public Health. That's pretty long, Kavita. I hope I made a mistake. Please forgive me. Correct it yourself. She was earlier a David Bell Research Fellow, Center for Population and Development Studies at Harvard University, and also was awarded the Balson Fellowship for work on social inequality and helped by University College London. A training in history at Trinity College, Cambridge University, and the Jawaharlal Nehru University. Experience in archival work, policy debate, and public health practice in Global South brings together a rich interdisciplinary perspective anchored in rigorous historical method. Her research has focused on politics of indigenous Ayurvedic medicine and its reconfiguring in the late colonial context of India, the global politics of aging, and the history of consumption and disease in South Asia. Welcome, Kavita. Over to you.
Thank you, Professor Mulyal. Indeed, our old friendship goes back a very long time, and it's one of my fondest memories. And I think, considering the work I've been doing now again concerning CMC Vellore and the history of cardiology and community health, I think I've always got back to you for as a touchstone to be able to guide me. This is a particularly special and looked forward to lecture that I'm delivering. Good evening to everyone, and I'd like to extend my heartfelt thanks to the organizers of the seminar. JNU is my alma mater, and it gives me huge pleasure to, as many others, to return here and to be able to have the honor to be invited by Professor Ritu Priya and Professor Anand Krishnan. I thank you especially for inviting me and for organizing this panel. Professor Mulyal for being here, and the respected Professor Kadir, my fellow keynote speaker. All of your careers have really embodied a kind of a moral aspect as well as a professional aspect for me of a public health conscience, which is deep and abiding and has been a touchstone for me in my work going forward. I'm also turning to many old friends and colleagues who have been an abiding presence and very supportive over the years in my own career at CSMCH, which is my friend and collaborator and colleague, Rama Baru, who was also a Yusuf Hamid Fellow here at Columbia, Mohan Rao, Rajiv Das Gupta, Ramila Bisht. I can't quite enumerate everyone, but I just want to enclose everyone who has been very supportive to me. I'd also like to thank Apurva and Shivangi for their presentation. And I think I agree with many of the reflections that Professor Kadir made, commenting on some of the linearity, which sometimes tends to kind of color the ways in which we look at the progression of public health, when actually so much of public health is not these binaries, not this kind of linear progressive movement, but very much a movement of tensions, of going back and forth, and a lot of circularity, rather than, which really encompasses, I think, a much more interesting trajectory than something that is simply linear. I want to start really by also speaking a little bit about my journey. I was trained at the History Center at CHS at JNU, and subsequently I worked in community health, including cardiovascular disease programs, with a colleague and friend, Professor Arima Mishra, whom I'm very happy happens to be would be chairing the comments on the panel. And subsequently, I've been trained in other places, but the abiding questions that have reflected my work have come really from my training in JNU. So I want to start by opening up to, Ritu, will I be able to share my screen?
Yeah, Kavita, you should be.
Okay.
It's visible.
Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay,
yes,
great.
you're on.
Great. Okay. So I want to start really very briefly by addressing one of the core puzzles, I think, that is there. Very quickly before I start, yes, Dr. Mulyal, I have all of these affiliations that seem very complicated, but my core position is in the School of Public Health, and my affiliation in the Butler Aging Center, but I also happen to have an appointment in the Department of History and the Center for Science and Society. So I want to start by really looking at this puzzle, I think, which is very interesting, which I think has been posed to us as speakers when we speak about the contours of public health. One of my main questions, which is going to kind of shape my talk today, is how have we historically arrived with the current contours of public health that we have today in terms of both terms, ideas, and categories. On the one hand, we are told in terms of the conventional rhetoric that at a national level, public health education is expanded, research, policy, there's extensive validation for public health. There's a wider institutional power and apparatus, especially during COVID, that expanded. We have a large health workforce, we have techno-scientific support. So some of the mythology around public health is, of course, that the elephant has grown much, much bigger. The bus is much, much bigger. Now, we also have a range of reiterated commitments that have come, from both the WHO, but also from other agencies. When they speak about the importance of social determinants of health, we are told constantly that public health is now extremely consequential. And everyone, universally, any conference or meeting you go to, the first lines generally are that they have and they affirm public health equity and social justice is important for them, as are the social determinants of health. In fact, the words are used so often, sometimes I feel that they've lost their meaning. So I want to really go back to talk about the politics that have really continued and posed the kinds of challenges we see in public health today. We continue to have gaps in equitable public health access and care, particularly a gap in trust in public health and political agencies. There's widening disparities, a lack of social protection, and the marginalization of the poorest. Many of the points that Professor Kadir made just recently, and I want to kind of build on them. But the question I have is, why is redefining the contours of public health consequential or important to us? And I think the matter is really important because of the kinds of lags in public health education, workforce, and needs that we continue to have. And in my opinion, it's really because I don't think that the infrastructure and the architecture of public health today, the way we have it, is actually poised to be able to address a range of the challenges in population health that are in front of us. And two of them that I will briefly touch on at the end of my talk are really population aging and climate change. We need the kinds of infrastructure that deal with the sorts of crisis, especially for the most vulnerable groups when we think of climate change. And when we think of population aging, we have to go beyond some of the conventional paradigms that we've had so far in public health. My talk really centers, therefore, on ideologies and the politics and the forms of epistemology, or the kinds of knowledge that have formed public health, when public health has had to cope with consistent crisis over time. So when I'm framing my argument, what I'd like to really emphasize is the past contours and legacies of public health. How have public health crises shown us whose lives are of value at risk, and what are the kinds of bodies and lives that are marginal? It's not new that we see that certain groups are valued over others, certain bodies are valued over others. They are seen more at risk than others. But what are the longer genealogies that lie behind this? Why is it that certain populations and bodies have been prioritized in terms of their health? And in terms of public health itself, how can we look just beyond contours or the kind of perimeters or the borders and boundaries? And how can we also look at the content of public health? How is it that the contents and agenda of public health policies have tended to align with wider economic interests and social hierarchies, but have failed to address and to deepen to be able to address the kinds of the kinds of priorities that should be there in the names of social justice? And then I want to also talk a little bit about the future contours of public health itself. So in terms of disease knowledge, I want to take us back briefly historically to thinking about how, when we think of climate change today, we think that it's really the first time that a certain kind of climatic determinism in health has come up. But there is a longer history of adaptation and climatic determinism that we see in public health and public health epidemiology. And that really was rooted in the understanding of tropical medicine. So I want to go back briefly to understanding the origins of the framing of public health in places like South Asia, in India, where colonial capitalism and public health were deeply enmeshed in each other. That's the first form of capital that I want to outline to you. So when we think of climatic determinism, we're thinking about really the anxieties, the kinds of anxieties that colonial administrators had in terms of migration. How can you migrate? How could white bodies be resettled in warm climates? What are the kinds of different disease conditions that this would spawn? How would their bodies reconcile themselves to malaria, to plague, to fevers, to gangetic cholera? And how would this really align with the miasmas, the heat, the humidity, and the secretions that possibly compromised bodies and led to physical degeneration and indolence? And that's the second point I want to make, that apart from climate, and we are also talking about efficiency and productivity. Capitalism, whether it's colonial capitalism or globalized capitalism, has always centered on bodies in terms of efficiency and productivity. And when we talk about indolence and degeneration, these are not just colonial novels, but these are actually hard economic decisions that were being made in terms of capital. How long would the body or the efficiency of a British soldier last in, how many monsoons would a British soldier last in Bengal? The costing of empire was very important, and the costing aspect of public health has always really inspired the kinds of medical framings that have appeared to be able to align with this kind of costing of empire. At that point, of course, immunity as capital was really crucial. Surviving the tropics and overcoming vulnerability was important, and climatic and geographic determinism really are the roots. The early genealogy of public health was really based on the pathologizing of certain places, certain climates, certain races, and pathologizing the other in terms of their health. And therefore, we see that tropicality or tropical difference, which we continue to see in terms of the evoking of disease, was one of the first things that actually preoccupied public health. The second really is the fears of acclimatization. How can white settlers acclimatize and adjust to the heat of India? And remember that notions of acclimatization and adjustment are not only associated with colonial medicine. They have continued to stay with us. As a person who works on aging, one of the first theories that comes up in the 1960s and 70s and continues to plague us when we think about the so-called challenges of population aging is the notion not of acclimatization, but adjustment. So acclimatization, adjustment, adaptation to climate change, all of these are ways in which capitalism as well as the state try to shift the responsibility of adaptability and adjustment, which are risks to health, onto individuals rather than the responsibility of the state. So acclimatization is a framing that emerges in tropical medicine, but under different kinds of vocabularies, it continues to be with us today. And the fears of acclimatization are rooted really in the fact that certain kinds of climates could lead to aging very quickly, could lead to the degeneration of bodies. It could lead to both physical and moral degeneracy. And this is one of the things that have kind of dogged public health over time. And then we see that the contours of public health at this time continued to be dominated mostly by the aspects of infectious disease. And what was invisible at that time was really the fact that you had cases of chronic diseases, and India's backwardness at that time was seen as a representation of not being able to be a space or site that would have chronic diseases. So cancers and heart disease and all of these diseases were supposedly seen, but they were also made invisible. So certain kinds of bodies could only have certain kinds of diseases. And the absence of chronic diseases was really associated very strongly with certain kinds of races and also local ethnicity. Recognizing diseases and managing them requires what Charles Rosenberg calls acts of agreement. So I want to point out that often we are very, very quick to blame British colonial rule, tropical medicine onto administrators or colonial medical administrators. But we have to remember that there was an upper class and upper caste male elite mostly that populated medical colleges, that set up the first public health schools, who framed and responded to these kinds of theories of bodily difference and these theories of disease etiology. So some of the first responses that were made regarding the absence of chronic disease, for instance, were made by Indian physicians. And you see that, for instance, in the work of Dr. Uma Prasanna Basu, who was at the Calcutta Medical College, in the 1920s, Basu, who was a teacher of medicine at the Calcutta Medical College, examines about 446 people suffering from heart disease over 10 years of hospital and private practice. And Basu describes many diseases that would have been familiar to European physicians. He talks about arrhythmias, angina, dilation, endocarditis. He talks about the tobacco heart, the alcoholic heart. But he also then begins to say that Indian epidemiology and Indian climate is itself distinctive, that heart diseases in Bengal differ as widely from those that are seen in the different clinics of Europe as the hieroglyphics of Egypt differ from the pictures of writings of Mexico. So you could have certain diseases in the West, but heart disease in India was a very, very different picture. Instead, he found that there was a degeneration of the myocardium, which was absolutely independent of coronary sclerosis, he said. So what he spoke about was the flabby heart. The flabby Bengali heart was one of the theses that he had. He says, which made Bengalis lack a certain kind of physical endurance. They were prone to having a poor diet, and there was greater vasodilation in hot climates. So the heat of the Bengal climate, the heat also made people lazy and lethargic, and the majority of whom did not take proper exercise, he said about the Bengalis. And this ill-nourished heart really went to waste from a lack of proper blood supply. So it's very interesting that the notions of public health are also based on certain kinds of ideas of difference. These ideas of difference and stigmatization have evolved not only from colonial writers, but they've also evolved in the ways in which our own elite, our own social, male, upper caste, and other elite have also responded to this and tried to kind of respond to colonial subjecthood and the psychosis that came with it and responded to it. And I was very interested because Dr. Mulial is here, and Dr. P. Kutumbaya, who was one of the founders, who was the director for a long time of cardiology in CMC Vellore. He then writes about rheumatic heart disease. For many decades until the 1940s, it was said that you could not find a single case of rheumatic heart disease in India. It was a disease of temperate climates. So and at that point, Kutumbaya writes quite a well-known article. Then he says, and this was not just him reporting pathology as a kind of trivia, but he concludes that you could have rheumatic heart disease in South India and the tropics. And he was then addressing a persistent medical debate, and he needed to really clinch that argument at that point. So Indian biologies and pathologies were viewed as incommensurable with white British pathologies. But subsequently, Indians have built on that kind of racism to be able to build their own ideas of difference about ethnicities and caste and other kinds of ways in which we have discriminated against populations and typified certain kinds of diseases as diseases of poverty, as Imran Adi was saying, as certain kinds of diseases having evolved and kind of taking away, kind of referring to Ritu's work, from a certain kind of dignity which is associated with public health, that people associate with their health status, rather than simply seeing them as biomedical objects or subjects. So what we see here is really inversions in biology and society. And over time, these discourses of difference based on race, climate, immunity have got inverted. Indians are now currently viewed as particularly vulnerable to heart diseases at earlier ages due to the kinds of, and we are again different due to the stressors of exposed Indian metabolisms due to pollution. And more recently, we've again kind of put forward the same kinds of theories relating to immunity and kind of difference when we speak of COVID, for instance. In the summer of 2020, questions of intrinsic immunity came up with COVID-19. And the research papers that actually attested to the fact that India shows this was before the second wave, India shows a less severe COVID-19 likely because it has more trained hosts due to endemic exposure to intracellular pathogens. The tropical region has reported fewer mortalities. So from being a place that is compromised, where there is only infectious disease, we become a place that actually could have some immunity because we've been exposed to infections all our life. So others attributed immunity to previous induced immunity relating to polio and BCG vaccines for TB that was still given in countries. So in many ways, immunity became a kind of notion of innate immunity at this time. So the COVID-19 crisis highlighted, like the HIV/AIDS pandemic before it, the crucial importance of debates around the intersections between the biological and social narratives of immunity and infection. And I would really argue that the notion of immunity and immunity is deeply linked again to the state wanting to safeguard and prioritize certain kinds of bodies that are productive, bodies that are efficient. And we don't really want to start a discourse of bodies that are seemingly dependent or enfeebled or could possibly be vulnerable or marginalized. So there is a valorization in public health, and similarly through these theories of who can survive and undertake their own risks. I move from there to a second framing that I want to bring out. Public health was not only shaped by tropical medicine, but between the 1940s and 80s, when a Nehruvian elite articulated ideas about industrialization and about modernization, what you see is then a real crisis in trying to understand how we could move from colonial underdevelopment to post-colonial development. And at this point, a range of other kinds of studies come up. And these are diseases, particularly after partition, which bring up not only public health, but also issues of mental health. People like, I'll show you an image of him, M.V. Govindaswamy here, who is the founder of the Indian, the NIMHANS in Bangalore, became fascinated with the idea, how do you deal with populations in the 1940s and 50s that have gone through the kind of trauma that partition has brought with it. But underneath the foundations of mental health at this time, again, was the concern, can we really make these people good workers in factories? What happens to populations that go through collective trauma? So social behaviors and the birth of even occupational medicine and industrial medicine in India is rooted really on trying to understand and come to terms with these new vocabularies that are being coined, but also so that these kinds of bodies could be allied to economic modernization. So what we need at this time, you have this scientific agenda of modernization and industrialization, and also self-reliance. So for instance, when you had the first revelations of asbestosis, for instance, in many factories, they would say that no, Indians are actually immune to asbestos poisoning. What is happening is actually that these constitutions of workers is that they're already coming to the factory in weakened ways. They're already coming to the steel factory in Jamshedpur or the factory in Durgapur. They already have weak constitutions. They can't be compromising our project of industrial modernization. So public health, even in a post-colonial perspective, however much we may go back to the Bohr Committee report, which seems to be a point where all scholars kind of jump off to say, this was the good vision and this was the ways in which the vision failed. But the Nehruvian vision had all of these, had both a kind of vision of improvement, and vision of science and post-colonial modernity, but it also was deeply problematic in terms of the ways in which industrialization and modernization was undertaken. And I think that's something we cannot get away from. And public health at this time expands to understand the chronic, but it was also interested in factory workers, in apathy, in absenteeism in industry. So we move from just counting mortality to be able to measure morbidity. How can we, for instance, understand neurosis in factories? So these are very fluid pathologies, which are both economic, but they're also epidemiological in implications. And this is really the history of some of the post-colonial public health that also evolves at this time that we cannot kind of turn away from. And these are pictures, of course, of, this is the Durgapur Steel Project, which is being inaugurated by Rajendra Prasad. And then this is M.V. Govindaswamy at NIMHANS. And then, the roots of what I was terming as industrial and occupational medical research, which looked at toxic exposures, which looked at heat fatigue and apathy. But really, India really had to cope with different development pressures. Just as with globalization, we can't focus too much on the health of our workers and our labor force because we have to catch up with the West. So the notion of all the kinds of transitions that we envision for us, the modernizing transition, the industrializing transition, hasn't allowed us to be able to say that we need to pause to be able to think of that not only about development, but to be able to say that we might have not just different kinds of health, but we may actually need to address health and health-related issues, especially in the labor sector, with the kinds of priorities that we needed to have. This is, of course, images of the founding of Jamshedpur. So when we are talking about the remaking of the contours of public health, as we're doing in this talk, we are speaking first of tropicality and difference and its inversion, also by local actors. We are talking about the making of the chronic body, not just mortality, but the morbid body that comes up in the 50s and 60s and stays with us. Because, and especially in the context of aging, I can constantly see the fact that we are marginalizing and tend to generalize bodies that are seen as morbid, bodies that are seen as being unproductive to cope with the kind of targets we have in globalized India. The third section that I want to highlight is really the fact that part of the problems plaguing public health and its contours has to do with the kinds of models of futurology, of what we've tried to predict in terms of transition models. We've espoused models which have come up mostly in the US after the Second World War, which is the kinds of theories of the demographic transition, which evolved in the Princeton Population Bureau. We all know about Abdul Omran's transition model of the epidemiological transition. All of these theories really promised us, in a way, especially promised countries in the global south, that if they undertook a certain trajectory of industrialization and modernization, they would actually see progressive shifts in disease and population patterns. And, you know, I'm very careful to acknowledge that Abdul Amran himself later on decides to amend some of his theories, the fact that there's been a critique of the epidemiological transition theory. But there has been a sense that the meta-narrative has to come from the West, that the meta-narrative of the ways in which we are going to make a transition from infections to chronic diseases, from high fertility to low fertility, from low life expectancy to high life expectancy, has to happen in this linear, progressive fashion, as it's happened in our ways of imitating certain kinds of economic transitions. So our understandings of public health and demography have aligned with those economic goals and that narrative rather than being for themselves. All of these are really modeled along those lines. And therefore, when we're thinking about the kinds of global models and metrics that have shaped public health, what we have often lacked is a more local situated engagement and research. The kind of research that we've been talking about, that we know very well, has been happening at CSMCH. These models have been, the contours of public health, therefore, have often been complicated by data projections and metrics that have often not been locally situated. And in that sense, I'll turn very quickly in this talk to also now speaking about aging, longevity, and climate change as an example of the continuing tropes that we see in an age of globalization and post-globalization, where we are constantly again made to understand that the kinds of transitions and changes that we are seeing with aging in India, for instance, are happening before their time. In a lot of the literature, both in India and in China, what we see is that India or China are growing rich before they grow, growing old before they grow rich. Now, it's a deeply problematic trope to say that actually, if people had public, if America, after growing rich, can promise a better public health system, I would be very impressed. But growing rich doesn't clearly mean a better public health system. But part of it comes from the fact that our experts, our public health experts, demographic experts, and a lot of the private sector, McKinsey and other consultants constantly rely on the temporality of these models. The fact that France took 115 or 120 years to effect the demographic aging and the demographic transition. You had falls in mortality, you had improvements in public health, you had an increase in life expectancy, and whatever India or China or other countries are doing, we are doing it within a compressed time of 26 or 25 years or 30 or 40 years. So the notion that whatever we do, we are doing in ways that are different from the West, but also compromise us because we are doing it without the resources, we are doing it without the kinds of time or temporality that they had, is one that is something that we need to challenge. That because it again actually aligns very deeply to accept these models is also to not accept these models also implies that we then have to challenge these temporalities. The fact that a compressed demographic transition and to just look at certain kinds of demographic dividend, as we are told, is not the way to understand what really is happening when we are thinking of the demographic transition. After all, there is not a rise in life expectancy across board all over India. We know very well that if you, I'll come to this a little later, but I want to quickly show you India's 50+ population today. And this is a very commonly shown growth chart regarding population aging and the rate of expected shifts in the population growth by 2050. So what has this resulted in? It means really that we are speaking about, a new kind of public health crisis, and which has been dominated by the rhetoric of these global transition models. Which has led to us basically saying that we need to grow a market, which is a market for access to drugs and devices that's problematized. We need to medicalize global mental health. And aging is viewed really as a kind of gray tsunami. The fact that everything there is kind of clouding it into, it could be both a silver market of opportunity for private markets. At the same time, there is a generalization that it's likely to impact every economic system and every kind of welfare system. So what is missing in this discourse is really the fact that we need to think beyond the kinds of tropes that these kinds of temporalities are offering us. We need to think, for instance, of care, even though we've been thinking for too many decades simply of eradication, of cure, of magic bullets. So we need to think particularly of understanding what are formal and informal networks of care. How can they be supported by the state? How can we understand the so-called binary between state responsibility and families, not simply as being a binary of the state pushing all responsibility on families and the families expecting everything from the state, to saying that there are ways in which you could strengthen social capital. You could not see perhaps aging and health simply as a different and separate constituency and not decide that all old people need to be a separate demographic category and they need to be in institutional homes, but instead see intergenerationality, especially in a country which has both in many states, growing numbers of youth and high fertility, versus in many states in South India and others where you have low fertility and a demographic transition and a fall below replacement rates of demographic numbers, right? So how can we think of something which is not some overarching model, but how can we look at difference? How can we look at local particularities? And how can the state itself strengthen networks of social capital and look at intergenerational solidarity rather than to look at one constituency facing the other, especially with limited resources. There was a time when I remember Arima Mishra and I were both working, I remember with Dr. Srinath Reddy, and you would go into a Ministry of Health office and they would say, well, we can't fund any projects relating to chronic disease because we are only doing infectious disease. So it's not an either or situation, funding youth versus old age, infectious versus chronic disease. We all know with notions of syndemics, with the clustering of diseases, that all of these are interlinked. And what is really missing from the contours of the public health narrative is the understanding really of marginalized communities. Even when we think of population aging and we just in a blanket way say, oh, longevity, life expectancy has increased all over. It's not just this gift of an increasing life expectancy. When we think particularly of Dalit women, for instance, when we think of a healthy and active life expectancy, are we simply talking about a rise in life expectancy, or are we also speaking of the notion that Geronimus has of weathering when she talks about African-American women and the fact that over time, when you have survived or coped with structural racism, you age before your time. Even when you're chronologically 40 or 45, you actually have the health or the constitution of someone who is even much older. So when we are talking about even notions of aging, of demographic shifting, and these kinds of projects, we see longitudinal aging surveys, we see a range of data that's being collected. But we need this kind of data to also be speaking to experiences of bodies, of qualitative studies and others, because we are thinking not simply of how we can shift the whole kind of median from one to the other. And as many people who are doing aging would say, that we should just compress mortality and morbidity. Let's just make sure everyone is ill only for the last 3 months of their lives, and we can make them active and aged till then. But that completely ignores the kinds of a life course of the kinds of inequalities and disparities that people have endured in their bodies. So I want to really say that, just taking the lens of aging itself, I want to bring up the problems with binaries such as infectious and chronic diseases. I want to speak really about how we value bodies and how we define the contours of public health has been very much based on notions of capital, on what kinds of capital those bodies have offered us. The third point I want to make is, can we move from just thinking about cures to thinking about care? And how can we think of it as a responsibility not of one or the other, but how can we integrate this? And then the final point I really want to make is one of the the fact that each of these problems is not going to arrive to us as public health experts, public health workers and practitioners just one by one. As we knew with HIV, that it came in the form of an infection. It stayed behind with its chronic elements. It clustered as a syndemic. So when we think, for instance, of climate change and aging, for instance, there are a range of now new ESCAP and other reports, that the ESCAP report of 2022, which had these very alarmist predictions. This is the new kind of temporality, that Asia and India form a kind of riskscape. The fact that we are going to have the highest heat temperatures, we are going to have the largest number of floods, and what is going to be the climate aging intersection, because a lot of our countries are going to be a site of riskscapes, and we are going to be at a tipping point for health and environmental hazards. A range of these framings are very problematic in the ways in which they characterize certain places, certain populations as constantly being compromised by certain kinds of threats. And public health itself doesn't mean that we can just cope with one challenge at a time, but we could have crisis in ways in which we have to deal with a cluster that will make us address these crisis at the same time. And I saw this particularly when I was interviewing policymakers in Tamil Nadu and Kerala, particularly after the floods in Chennai, of how they had to deal with older people who were actually stranded in their homes. In Kerala, people who had to have chronic disease-related cancer and heart disease medicine that had to be delivered to their homes. So many times, different kinds of vulnerability occur and cluster at the same time. So how can public health cope with this when we think of them not simply as singulars for us to solve one disease campaign at a time? Let's solve smallpox and then we solve malaria. So the past has shown us, and Rajib's very impressive work and Shonjoy's work have shown that these kinds of claims of magic bullets have not worked. So as a conclusion, I really want to say that what we are seeing is a set of changes which we haven't witnessed in the world before. As a historian, I hate to often say that, because often you see movements in common in the past. But we do know that we haven't experienced this kind of a demographic situation before. We haven't seen the kinds of crises we've seen with climate before. But that doesn't mean that we are simply characterized as riskscapes or places that have done something in a wrong trajectory or have come to a certain condition at the wrong time. I think this takes away from a sense of the agency of older people, takes away from the agency of places and our ability to be able to respond and to cope. At the same time, I don't think we have to kind of respond only to global targets of what the Global Climate Change Panel calls, when it kind of wrapped sub-Saharan Africa on the knuckles, saying you have a climate change deficit, that you have not adaptation deficit, you haven't adapted enough. So we don't want to be told from the outside, but we need to have a public health contour that cannot ignore local context, cannot ignore the agency of older people, of the most marginalized populations, and not think in some ways that we are the people speaking for them and on behalf of them. So how can we make sure that this is a much more integrative approach It's not elitist either from outside or within the country. And we don't see India itself as a homogeneous whole facing these in a kind of temporal framing. And how can we see this as much more complex? Very much for me as a historian, as something which is historical, which is why life course really interests me, to understand how each generation faces a certain kind of public health challenge and how we can make sure we bond it a long time. So thank you very much again for inviting me. And I look forward to the questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Kavita. That is an excellent presentation. And of course, I'm not surprised. I've already impressed you communicate. I'm going to stick to my schedule, and I'm going to call upon Ritu to bail me out at this point because she has a different task to do. Ritu, over to you.
Madam, you are muted. Dr. Ritu, you are muted. Please unmute.
Sorry, thanks for that. Yeah, saying that I'll introduce the first discussant, who I can see has a tough time. Dr. Arima Mishra is a professor and associate director at the School of Development, Azim Premji University, with more than 23 years of teaching and research experience. Her overall research is located at the methodological interface between medical anthropology and public health. She has worked on a range of themes, including tribal health, health system policies and practices, frontline health workers, work and health. Teaches courses on understanding health systems and policy, public health ethics, health, medicine and society, and advanced qualitative research inquiry. So, Arima, over to you.
Thank you.
For your comments and directions.
Yes, thank you. And thanks to both the speakers, for such wonderful insights. And I think all of us, we do agree that, these moments of, pause in the history and journey of public health are important. And I think both of them have really situated the need to even ask this question, ask the question of why should we redefine the contours of public health? There is it's not just an intellectual exercise for the sake of it. The fact that many of the kinds of challenges that we are talking about in public health, in terms of widening and persisting, right, health inequalities, is something that continue to stare at us. And public health as an enterprise is supposed to be addressing that. That is the kind of goal of public health. As well as Kavita said, that while within the larger landscape of social inequalities that we are talking about in health, and some of the problems remain as it is, very familiar. We don't want to see it sometimes, we want to see it sometimes, but also the whole question that some of the slightly different, emerging kind of challenges, and she demonstrated it largely through this whole question of aging, right? Because while we are celebrating on the one hand that, well, there is increase in life expectancy, but we really don't know how to kind of, handle aging as a problem. So there is a real crisis, which is why we really need to kind of ask this existential question about, what is this contour of public health? What is common and very nicely illustrated by both of them is that what is at the center of this question is the history and politics of that is associated with definitions and terminologies, associated with the knowledge that gets to define, the boundaries or not the boundaries of public health, and hence, that defines many other things, including all these models that we are talking about. What I like in this history and politics, because something that we get to see is that, when these new kinds of terms come about, whether it's One Health and then global health, etc., then, global health was really flourishing and people were really liking it. Before then, Didier Fassin actually wrote a piece called What is Global About Global Public Health? That really kind of stopped people saying, okay, yeah, I mean, I think we need to interrogate. It's very interesting. Recently, a colleague asked me that, so right now you are more into public health, not so much health systems. So I think we also did to, this is a reflective exercise. Are health systems different from public health? Because we also get into this tendency of, creating some kind of boundary where we are thinking we are doing something very great and new and innovative, and which actually takes us away from public health in that sense. So in this history and politics, before we get carried away by One Health and planetary health and all these nicely sounding buzzwords, we need to ask whether these evolving terminologies actually are taking us away from public health and its fundamental goals, the way that we are talking about this definition by Winslow, right? Or it's actually restricting. I think the key tension that was spoken about in terms of that, whether through the use of terminologies, all these planetary health, etc., or about universal health coverage, etc. On the one hand, it's actually trying to restrict the scope of public health, right? So that is why I think I really like when Professor Kadi talks about that what is to be at the center is actually a lot of unpacking of the public being at the center, that's the populations at the center, and the health that we are talking about. And I think it's interesting that both of them, and Kavita actually added a much more layer to these populations, that who are we talking about when you're talking about populations? Whose bodies matter? Because no matter how much, the definitions really, in some sense, smoothen us, saying that, yeah, this is the goal. You need to prevent diseases, you need to promote health, well-being, and you need to protect, etc. It sounds very nice, but the moment you try to actually operationalize, you see that, okay, but whose bodies are we talking about? And how do these bodies actually come about, which is what she spoke about in the sense of immunity, immune bodies or non-immune bodies or chronic bodies or diseased bodies. Some sections of the population remain diseased. Sometimes we want to acknowledge and sometimes we don't want to acknowledge. And that understanding of pathologizing body, which is actually not a biological act, it's a social act, right? And she traces it to kind of, as much as that we talk about the colonial medicine to be at fault, but it's a social act in the sense that there is, it operates within the larger, political economy, where we are talking about whether it's capitalism or liberalism or the certain kinds of political ideology. That actually restricts the definitions of public in trying to privilege certain populations and certain bodies and certain health. And actually, again, restricting the definitions of health to either just the technologies or just the medical care. So I think this pulling and pushing through the kinds of knowledge that we're talking about, whether tracing it to tropical medicine or in different ways, these expert models that we are talking about, actually we really need to ask whether they are doing justice to the socially embeddedness that Professor Kadir talks about, or the social purpose of public health that we are talking about. Is it really doing service to that? And I really want to kind of echo this point that Kavita actually mentioned towards the end, is all these models that we are talking about. I think that, I read it in the concept note that we should ask that what are the theoretical perspectives, that really help us comprehend and address the, complexity of public health, challenges. I think we should ask a different question. It's not about what are the theoretical perspectives. I think we should ask what are the new ways of theorizing, which can actually help us address this complexity, is something that we should be asking, because otherwise we are actually in a circle all the time thinking, okay, this model, but it's slightly little different. Okay, then we're trying to adapt it all the time. And I think, and that's where this whole questions of then what kind of orientation that is going to help us. Again, I really want to kind of echo and resonate in terms of when you're talking about interdisciplinarity, or even, many people are talking about transdisciplinarity, much more pronounced in the literature on the sustainability transitions than perhaps public health, but that's something which is important. Knowledge, not just from the world of academia and academic disciplines, but also the world of practice. What it really requires, there is no other way, but it is a reflective exercise, because we can't, and I think we have fought enough saying, medicine is superior to anthropology and anthropology is superior to something else. And I think we have done it enough. So I think that it really requires each one of us so much to look within as to look outward. And hence collaboration and active listening and dialogue is what is going to help us in saying that, okay, what is it that we are trying to do? So that goals of public health, I think, should be the anchor point for why even we need to justify, or we think that interdisciplinarity is something which is important. Yeah, so that's where I would stop though. But thank you so much for inviting me, and yeah.
Thank you, Rima. Thanks for highlighting all those points, which again raise some more questions for us. The second discussant is Dr. Anand Krishnan, Professor and Head, Center of Community Medicine, AIIMS, New Delhi. With widely varying interests in different aspects of public health, he's been a keen researcher and led many successful collaborative research projects with WHO, ICMR, CDC. The USA has more than 400 publications, and he has been listed in the top 2% of the global researchers for 3 consecutive years, from 2019 to 22 by Stanford University. He heads the WHO Collaborative Center for Capacity Development and Research in community-based NCD prevention and control, and has worked as international consultant for drafting of the national NCD prevention control strategy, provided technical assistance for national NCD risk factor surveys to many Southeast Asia region countries. So over to you, Dr. Anand Krishnan, also being the one part of conceptualizing this whole webinar and the organizing of it.
Thank you, Dr. Ritupriya, for involving me in conceptualizing this whole exercise. And as you can all see, we try to get a mix of young, the old, and the middle, different spectrums of age to think about this area of evolving public health. And also looking at it from a historical perspective. And as Dr. Imran Kadir rightly said, we started with a very linear and simpler explanation of the evolution. And I'm sure over the last 1.5 hours, we would have understood that it is a much more complex phenomenon. The subject is not only evolving, it will continue to evolve. And bad news for especially the younger generation who seem to have an identity crisis, that this identity crisis is not going to end in future as well. So you have to continue to engage with it because the contours will keep changing. It is interesting, in the previous session, the inaugural session, when Dr. Ritupriya was introducing their department, their department is incidentally known as Center for Social Medicine and Community Health. So it encompasses 2 terms that was discussed, and my department is Center for Community Medicine, which is a 3rd term. So let me start with discussing these 3 terms in the context of what we are discussing today. And this is what Dr. Ritupriya said, that when they conceptualized their department, the social medicine was sort of a top-down approach, where they were looking at, obviously it looks at social determinants and maybe non-health sectors, but largely looking at health in all policies, kind of an approach to improving health of the population. Whereas the community health is more of a bottoms-up approach, where it so probably involves more in looking at community empowerment approaches to improve communities' health. Whereas from community medicine, our department was one of the people who pushed for a change from PSM to community medicine. And from what I hear, it was a deliberate thought process. But more importantly, I think this community medicine group of people encompass the health system approach to improving community health. So that health system can play a catalyst role and strengthen to provide a more comprehensive care to people. So we are looking at 3 broad areas of approaches to improve health. through socially inclusive policies, through community empowerment, and through strengthening health systems. And I think that forms the basis of what we have been discussing. Then again, I'm coming from obviously a medical background, and sometimes I feel that maybe we are overreacting to this identity crisis. Maybe it is just a self-made crisis. It was not there. Frankly, when I was in my younger period, I never felt an identity crisis. I actually understood there's a crisis much later in my life, when I knew much more and I had much more breadth of knowledge. But largely, I think it also is from, especially for people in community medicine, it is because we come from medical approach, and medical disciplines are in general far more unitary and more stable disciplines. Unlike people who come from social background, I think they are more used to having a more broader and evolutionary types of disciplines. Though it's not that clinical medicine is a very stable one. We know a lot of biochemistry, physiological changes occurring, new medicines, new modalities. So any known science can be a sort of a stable. It will keep evolving. That's the nature of any sciences, both in terms of complexity as well as in terms of scope. Coming to the scope, I think, and again, I'm borrowing from the previous speakers. I may not implicitly name them, but I'm sure you will understand what I'm saying. So the question is, when we say the discipline is evolving, we seem to be meaning that its borders are porous. In other words, it keeps expanding. Or we also mean that its subsystems or element keep changing. And also the relationship between these elements keep changing. So so there are three levels of complexities. It is not only that borders are porous, the elements within the borders keep changing, and the relationship between them changing. So that is what is sort of, I'm describing the complexity. But this also raises the issue, if when I say the border, is border only expanding, or it also in some ways moves by leaving something behind. Because if we say it is only expanding, it means it continues to keep certain things. They always stay inside that border. But does something go out also? So again, I will give you some examples. To start with, say, environmental issues. And we discussed here that it started with environmental sanitation. Then we moved to industrial health. Frankly, in many community medicine, the environmental sanitation is no more given that importance. We almost, maybe there's a chapter there in the book, but hardly nobody teaches it. So in a way, environmental sanitation in its traditional form was left behind. Industrial health, then, but now it has come back as more of an air pollution and climate change. So again, it is evolving. We also discussed how initially in the conceptualization, animals were part of our conceptualization, but then again they got left out, but have now come back in a new form, or a old wine in a new bottle, called as One Health. So maybe these paradigms keep changing, maybe because of marketing reasons, maybe because of fad. Also, we looked at, initially we used to have a lot of focus on restricting births and making population small. And right now our whole focus is changing on to aging. So and we discussed about epidemiological transition from infective diseases to NCDs. Some diseases have been eliminated, eradicated, new diseases are keep coming. So that's the nature of the problem. Again, to me, obviously, whole of public health is, when the epiphany would be that when we thought that improving population health was beyond or more than just providing individual care, which is a good example of that kind of a thinking that really occurred. Is it when, as somebody said in the chat, is it when Rudolf Virchow said that medicine is nothing but social, this science in a large, this thing, where he talked about illness generating social conditions, and that we need to work in political and social life aspects of as well, not just be pure doctors? Was it when the Industrial Revolution led to environmental sanitation related interventions? Was it advent of preventive medicine, though it was more initially clinical? Was it the health sector reforms World Bank initiated? Is it the moving from purely mortality to a DALI's disability approach? Both came from World Bank in early 1990s. Or and obviously Jeffrey Rose, Sikh population, individuals in Sikh population. That also was a sort of a seminal work which looked at health promotion and how we need to shift the distributions of health parameters. And finally, with health in all policies from seminal work by Elena Bush. So obviously the subject is evolving, but I think more importantly, as been discussed by the speaker, we should not be too much concerned by the fact that subject is complex and evolving, but look at more at forces which are shaping this process. And we looked at forces which are the government, the community and health system, the three broad I started off with. But we have since then added a more globalization or the industry or the commercial determinants, which are far more important today than they were ever in the past. They were not at all considered in the past. And also decreasing role of WHO as compared to, say, Bill and Melinda Gates, focus on modeling and global burden of disease as the ultimate truth on anything in the world. So there is a complete change in the way, and we also discussed the shaping by colonialism. But ultimately, I think what has come is that the point was made that our transitions are much faster. I think there is a sense of urgency today in India and in the world, because these transitions, which took many years to occur, are occurring much faster in a much compressed time and in resource poor settings. And therefore, the challenge before us is that how do we evolve quickly to address these challenges? And these are very major challenges: changing disease burdens, newer risks like aging, climate change, privatization of health sector, decreasing social capital, increasing inequities, and as in the previous first public health oration, Professor Francis Baum said, transnational financialization and lack of regulation in the. So this all gives us a sense of urgency, and therefore we need to respond to this quickly, and we need to forget the theoretical aspects of differences, but pull our resources together. In the Indian context, we are still far away from our goal to achieve a healthy and equitable society. So finally, I will end with by saying that these are obvious implications for discipline, need for interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarities. I generally say that departments of community medicine are more closed in their approach to this. They need to be more open to collaborations and working with others. We need to be teaching more multidisciplinary teams and collaborate more. But for individuals who have this, I would suggest that you cannot know everything. You don't have to be a specialist in all the disciplines that areas of public health. Be aware of your strength, focus on that strength, but learn to collaborate with people who work in the other areas. So while we should all continue to dream for a more healthy and equitable and equip ourselves to make our efforts in that direction. In the end, I would just like to ask Dr. J.P. Millier to say how did he respond to Professor Jeremy Farrar when he made this distinction between public health and community health. He's going to speak after me, so maybe he will touch upon that. Thank you. Thank you for this wonderful opportunity and allowing me to express my thoughts.
Thank you, Anand. Thank you, Arima. Excellent presentation, and grateful for this final remarks on my side. Subramaniam Chandrasekhar, a Nobel laureate, he wrote a book on truth and beauty. And his thesis was, how do you recognize? He's a physicist, so recognize truth. Truth, he said, must have two qualities: beauty and simplicity. Beauty in physics is called symmetry. Simplicity means fewer the axioms you use, more stronger your belief would be. Now, the worry I have with public health is, are we getting more complicated? And I was looking at the graph presented, and I said, my few neurons remaining will not be in a position to imbibe all this complexity. I agree. But I remember when I joined public health or community health department in CMC in 1975, one of the important things I had to face was the habit of babies being branded. I don't know how many are familiar with it in other parts of the world. Tamil Nadu, they used to brand babies. And branding means they take needle, heat it up, and put it on the, on the foot, on the wrist, on the forehead, on the chest, and be hated. What were they trying to do? They were trying to create a scar. Why were they doing? The scars prevented. This was a concept of prevention. At the same time, we were struggling to get people to accept vaccination. Vaccine coverage was extremely low in 1976. Then we started talking to them about the BCG vaccination and told them, don't do this to your baby. We will give you a vaccine, which will give you a beautiful scar and no fuss, no problem. Now, I think in my reflection, I'm not making a scientific proposition. Our vaccine coverage actually started to improve, despite the fact DPT came with all this incessant crying, pain. But the redeemer was BCG, because it created scar. People love the scar. Bradford Hill, it is, factors that allows us to think causally, as one particular light. And I'm sure many of you teaching undergraduate students would have found it difficult to explain the meaning of the expression coherence of evidence. Coherence of evidence is a very personal point of view. When you look at the whole thing, does it make sense? Does it fit in with the worldview you have? It has nothing to do with p-values or odds ratios or nothing. It is personal. To people of Tamil Nadu, this scar was now replaced by BCG. And when we say it, pretend, they believe us. And in fact, Tamil Nadu rapidly reached very high level vaccine coverage. Now, I call that public health because the movement was making use of their beliefs and all changing over their attitude. That is, that's what my community helps. Not ordering people up, but suggesting that your way is one, but I can achieve the same thing with more. But that is to answer Anant's question. Okay, what did I answer? I did. We kept talking these two languages, and I enjoyed that evening. And continuing to press on community health when he kept on pressing public health. I am not against public health. My degree is in master in public health. My degree is in doctorate in public health. I had to get optics to give you that. But one thing I should tell you, learning from people is gone. And I think that teaching people, everybody wants to, but we don't want. I was a member of the committee which visited Kerala many years ago to review their leprosy control program. And I met a woman, a fisherwoman person, in the beach of Trivandrum. And I had my pro forma with her, prepared by Nirman Bhawan. And I had to ask some questions. And one question was, do you have, when you think about leprosy, I said, is leprosy a problem? She looked at me in the eye and said, at the moment, it's not a problem. But you start a program, it may become a problem. And it stuck me in my mind. Maybe we are the problem. Okay? Without understanding people's perspective, you start introducing, I don't think care for what you call it. It is not correct. And I think winning over people is still our main. It is an unjust world, and we need to take sides. And public health or community health or whatever you call it, I think we should weigh heavily side of people. I am so grateful I could come and be with you, and I thoroughly enjoyed the discussions. Good night.
Thank you for Mulyan, especially for that note on understanding people's perceptions and centering that as part of what, when we say people are center of what we are doing. I think after this evening of hearing people coming from very different disciplinary backgrounds, but all around the problem, or the problem that of identity that public health faces, has really been very enriching for all of us. I'd open the floor for those who've been listening and would like to ask questions or share some thoughts, but please restrict yourself to a minute or two and put your questions in chat if you would like. What I see in chat, there have been lots of comments, most of them very congratulatory to both the speakers, and echoing some of what has been said about cure to care, about the importance of the political context in which the discipline and its contours arise, and so on. I don't see what I can convert into a question. So are there questions that people would like to ask, or any further comments or ideas that they'd like to share? Please, the floor is open for that. We'll come back to the speakers at the end. So I can see that there are already light in both Imrana Di and Kavita is itching to say something. We'll come back to that. But let's hear if we have any of the participants. Don't see anything new coming in the chat.
Yeah. Hi, ma'am. Amitabh here.
Yes, Amitabh.
Can I say so?
Sure, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah. Thanks to both the speakers as well as other. It's a very interesting and engaging discussion. I would like to just flag one point. Say in the 20th century and more.
We lost your voice, Amitabh.
Yeah, we're not able to hear him. Yeah.
Maybe while he joins back, if anybody else has anything. There is Dinesh Abrol's query in the, or is it a query? Dinesh, would you like to put it yourself, or shall I read it out?
Yeah, no, I can put it. I know
Yes, please do.
preventive and curative have been unpacked over a period. I know that. And today also, they were unpacked by both Imrana as well as Kavita. But I think the aspect of care, if we have to sort of engage with, can we conceptualize what is we can call a caring state or a caring society? What meaning historically one can sort of offer over the period? Changes? Is there a understanding that and in the Indian context, if there is a observation, I would be benefited, I would be pleased. I would leave it to both the speakers, Kavita as well as Imrana.
Ritu, Are you waiting?
Ma'am, I would like to open that. I think that's a
sorry, ma'am.
question.
I am traveling.
Yeah.
Ma'am, Amitabh again. I'm traveling,
Yes.
so better I type actually. So okay.
Go ahead.
Let me type.
Go ahead.
I'm traveling.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Amitabh.
Okay. So the question was that. Okay. So to Professor Kadir, ma'am, how do you see the role of epidemiology changing, especially in the early 20th and 19th centuries of social and political articulation, which was very much embedded in social medicine, and in the 20th centuries of the public health, or in different versions of public health, which we are currently engaged. I actually recently did a study where, I saw a bit of changes, especially in the epidemiological investigation. So I am really interested to know how do you perceive. Thank you.
Thanks, Amitabh. We'll come to Deepika. You have your hand up. We'll take a few and then come back. Imran
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much. So my question is a little provocative, and it's just to all the speakers who would like to address it. I have seen the common narrative that I have seen, and I might be wrong, but the thing is that I see that we in the preventive and social medicine actually see the capitalists as, we are antagonizing them, or we are against the private sector, whereas they are also part of the population and they are also trying to bring in solutions. If I see myself sitting here in Delhi, if I have access to health, it's because of the hospitals that I have nearby. And so why should that access, I would like to, really applaud the efforts done by those who have created that access to me also. Can we be inclusive in that sense?
Okay, that's a very straight question. I think these three are enough to set us going. So, Imran Adi, would you take the floor first? We have three questions. One from Amitabh about role of epidemiology changing. Deepika is about the role of the private sector and supporting that as a form of access to healthcare. And Dinesh is about how do we unpack care, a caring society, and a caring state. Is Imran Adi there, or have we lost her?
No,
I think I said that I feel that both of us were actually unpacking the nature of the society only, how it controls, whether it's through bodies or through political ideologies. Obviously, Abrol, the state and the society are not so independent of each other. So the nature of the state depends very much on the kind of society you have. And in today's context, I would believe that the state has become the biggest obstruction to create a caring society. And I think when we were unpacking, we were only looking at the nature of the state and how it has transformed through reforms the public health sector and its conceptualization, its approaches. And I don't say this or that. I say we have to work at both the levels. You can't be just working with the state and not with the society. I would like to link it up with the point Professor Mulyal has raised, but the need to understand people. We are talking of interdisciplinary work. One way those who talk of transdisciplinarity distinguish themselves is that in their research itself, it's not only your perspective, but you bring in the understanding of the people. And I believe that for a caring society, working with people alters the perception of the problem itself. Working with people provides new opportunities and strategies to intervene, which we don't know. And I would actually like to say that constantly using the term we is a very dangerous thing. Please use I, because who are we? Sometimes we mix up ourselves with the state. Sometimes we are with the people. Sometimes we are talking of the academic discipline. So locate yourself. And once you do that, it becomes very clear that this group, this academic group, in its endeavor to see what is the expanse of public health, has come to a realization that conceptually it's everything. It's the institutional, it's the societal, it's the policy level, it's the international relations. Everything is affecting people and public health. But to say that we will redefine only for ourselves. We cannot redefine, because there are different groups who are defining public health, and we've already seen. And today, the World Bank, the IMF, and Bill and Melinda, they are defining public health. So I think we should be careful in the use of we. And the question of changes in epidemiology, and that earlier there was a social perspective, and now it has changes. Amitabh, I wish you had spoken of the kind of changes that you see. My own understanding is I can go back to 1936, the Bandung Conference, where Dr. Salskar Gun and John Stewart, these were two junior scientists of Ford Foundation who were working in India and China, and they presented their work on health in these two countries, wherein they have tried to do an integrated approach to health, talking about food, agriculture, nutrition. And what's very interesting is that when they presented this work in the Bandung conference, Paul Russell, who is the head of the Ford Foundation, just rejected that approach. And he didn't want it. And he wanted a straight technological, one disease, one program approach. So historically, you have social perspectives and you also have their opponents. And today in epidemiology, what I see is that there is so much domination of mathematics and statistics that people are being pushed out of epidemiology. I would like to know what you have found out. And the third question, Deepika. Deepika, I ended my talk about telling you we keep talking of people. Who are these people? And I gave you a very broad number of the kind of people we have. And I told you middle class, not more than 30%. Less than 5%, the super rich. 65% of the people are the people who are creating wealth in this country, on which we happily sit and talk academics. So when you say that the private sector is giving me health, yes, I know that. It is us and our needs and our comforts which help the private sector to survive. And it is by standing on our demands that they can suck the poor through the state support that they get to run their social insurances. Now, believe me, I have nothing against private sector. If they want to act as partners, then they should follow the spirit of partnership. Partnership means having shared objectives. Partnership means that you follow the rules of the game. If you say these are the diseases you will look after and you will have a costing system that is agreed upon, you will do it. The private sector refuses to do so. The private sector forces the state to go on hiking the subsidies that it gets, and we have shift of financial support from public sector to private sector. It is these tendencies that I criticize. I know that in Canada, you have the private sector. The regulatory systems are extremely effective. The private sector is responsible. The whole of Europe has this system. So I am talking specifically of India. I am talking of the privileges that the middle class has and therefore sees nothing wrong with private care. But if you are concerned about the majority, then you should know that the care in private sector is at least 5 times more costly than in the public sector. The coverage of private sector of the poor is minimal, and the quality of care they get is not necessarily the quality that is required by them, and the priorities are different. They from the poor, they pick up those who need tertiary care, but they will not bother about other common diseases. So there are problems, and I'm addressing those problems. Okay.
Thank you very much. That was very helpful, ma'am.
Ritu, would you like me to just add to what Professor Kadir said? Actually, I just wanted to first respond to the question from Dinesh Abrol. Thank you. I just wanted to say the question about unpacking this care in terms of the state and society. The real question is, how can we have, what are the kinds of incentives that you can have for the state to be able to politically say that it prioritizes, say, long-term care? And that happens it's happened in places like Tamil Nadu, for instance, or in terms of a certain kind of welfareism, because over time they have found political dividends from offering certain kinds of subsidies. But this is a kind of only first step towards saying that, if people are dependent or they are struck by lifelong poverty, there are ways in which you could get certain kinds of subsidies. That's a state that's interested in care, but that's more care in terms of social protection or certain kinds of social pensions. I really do feel that both the state and society have to prioritize certain kinds of social capital that is built to be able to truly answer the needs for care or a caring society. And that doesn't come from privileging just one group, but actually looking across groups, which is why I was talking about intergenerationality. That you can say that unless there are interests that are answered between groups, between interests, I don't think that a caring society, the locus of care itself is very important. And we have to recognize that however much technology we have, there are going to be some groups in society that will be vulnerable, that will be marginalized, and over time they will need care. So at some level, the question is not simply of efficiency or finances, but it's really a question of a moral kind. and what kind of a society and people are we? So I think care becomes a kind of something that is thrust as a burden on families, caregiving, and it's deeply feminized, as we know. So my problem really is that it's not sufficiently something that's prioritized in global health. It's not prioritized except when some private care services are offered. It continues to be in the background because it's so informal. It's kind of the elephant in the room, which is unaccounted for. But we need to bring it to the forefront. It is hugely underappreciated in terms of the labor all of us offer, which is not monetized. So I think that's a very big problem in public health because we count and our metrics are flawed when we don't really valorize certain kinds of things that are certain kinds of values and certain kinds of labor and service. So thank you. That was a very, very thought-provoking question. And coming down to Amitabh's question about the role of epidemiology, I do agree with Professor Kadir that it is getting most of our students at Columbia who are very quantitative will generally take epidemiology increasingly, and they actually want more and more quantitative tools. And the more you try to tell them that actually the tools are not good enough unless you know what questions you have to ask. What are the really big questions that are important and transformative? Tools at any point are going to be replaced by someone who has a better set of analytic tools than you. But I think epidemiology is increasingly moving away from a phase, the time when the Sassers were working, Zena Sasser and Mervyn and others were working on life course epidemiology. There were others who talked about, the social determinants and others. I think epidemiology is increasingly moving away more and more to biology, more and more actually to look at the use of technology. So I think this is one of the big challenges we have with epidemiology in the training in epidemiology, because increasingly it's trying to mimic more and more bench science. And that is something which takes it away from certain kinds of other social roots, just to answer Amitabh's question. But I think it's not without hope. I don't see why we couldn't, from India or other parts of Asia, set a trend to be able to look at this differently. Because I think we have the capacity to contribute to epidemiological theory and to offer new kinds of framings. Why shouldn't we be the people who could offer that rather than to be looking for epidemiology to be determined or to be oppressed by the sorts of trends they are showing? So I think it's time for that also. And I think we've certainly seen that. So I think that's important. I also think that global health has deeply shaped epidemiology into becoming more and more centered on economic metrics. And that has made an entirely big difference also with epidemiology. The other question that Deepika posed about capitalism, markets, and I don't think actually that we are saying that within the circle of public health, what is the place of private players? They've always had a role. I mean, Rama and I were discussing, for instance, and I think Professor Mulyal can attest to it. CMC Vellore was one of the first institutions that IDA SCUDA opens up to certain kinds of private paying patients, especially for lung surgery, cardiothoracic surgery, neurology, and other things. When they couldn't afford to put up offer certain kinds of service, they opened it up to paying. The question is not, I think, can people pay for services? Can you privatize? That's just the tip of the iceberg. The question is, what do we do about those who cannot afford these kinds of private services? In the name of social justice, do we kind of totally exclude them? How can we make sure and ensure? And we don't have that. I think the state gives up that capacity increasingly with the private sector to be able to monitor it, to be able to evaluate it, to be able to set some of the priorities. Unfortunately, the complicity of both the state and the private sector coming together for profit mutually means that agencies that could monitor each other or agencies that could balance out each other in some ways don't end up doing that. You will have a public clinic where the doctor will particularly not show up or be absent because they are doing some private time in a private clinic. So they are being complicit in many ways, and instead of operating as different spheres that could be complementary to each other. And yeah, I mean, I think in global health, there are plenty of examples during the height of the HIV crisis of public-private partnerships many of those, particularly in offering access to HIV medicines. And I think India provided a very good example with Cipla, for instance, the making of generic drugs, that we actually managed to contest the power of a lot of big pharma companies, big private pharma companies. And we've done that to a certain extent during COVID also, to a very limited extent, but we tried to do that. So I think it requires social movements, frankly. And unless we keep up, and the problem is social movements are increasingly seen as just deeply ideological or kind of, populated by people who have certain kinds of ideals, but clearly have not, you talk to a lot of public health theorists or practitioners, they'll say, social movements is one thing, but public health practice is another. But I think there's no other go. I mean, when you look at Kerala, for instance, even the ways they've pushed for palliative care legislation, for other kinds of care-related legislation, the way they make the government accountable for pension reform. I mean, it can only come from a buildup of social movements. And I think the private sector needs to be held accountable as a partner. And unless that occurs, then I think you have a situation where it becomes, the tail wagging the dog. It becomes so much bigger. It's like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the global, the Global Alliance for HIV, which became bigger than the WHO in the 1990s and later, right? It had a much bigger budget than the WHO itself. So how can public actors with low budgets and a very small presence speak very big, speak in very moral terms, but actually not be able to counter private actors at all? So there's a lot of things that are kind of elephants in the room that are not acknowledged enough when we just speak of the public and private debate. And a lot of it is that the private has been around for a long time, historically. And it's taken many forms. It's not just one crude, capitalistic, exploitative form. It's taken so many forms, and capitalism is insidious in the ways in which it adapts. And but it needs checking constantly. And like you said, if it can be put to good work and offer care, that's fine. But the question is who's left out, and what are these questions of inclusion and exclusion in this, which I think we cannot get away from as the kind of moral heart of, I think, what all of us, I think, rightly believe is at the heart of a public health mission for all of us.
Thanks a lot.
Okay. There's another round of questions. Now, people have obviously thought through some of their things. One that I'll pick up is from Lakshmi. Lakshmi, shall I just read it out quickly? Because we're now also...
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
She's basically, thanking, etc., and saying that the biomedical and social science disciplines must collaboratively work together needs no restating. But I'm struck by a seeming consensus that this can occur without acknowledging the contestation that exists between these disciplinary spaces at the level of ideas, ideologies, and methodologies. So basically about the challenges of doing interdisciplinarity. Who would go first?
Professor Kadir, would you like to respond?
No, I really don't want to, because this is where I began from. And I know it's no easy task to do this. And I said that in the very beginning, that it took us years, even in a small team, to interact, to understand, to listen, and to evolve methodologies, concepts, and find a common philosophical base to embed those. So I know that's the challenge, but today the subject of discussion is different, and we are not talking of the methodologies and the epistemology of knowledge as it evolves. Hopefully you will discuss all that in the coming debates.
Okay. Kavita, would you like to add
something? Ritu. Yeah, I know. I just quickly wanted to respond that, yes, it's true that interdisciplinary work is difficult, but I think, and challenging, and biomedical viewpoints often tend to treat the social sciences as a kind of, a step kind of child, in the sense that, but I think increasingly there is a recognition that there is the importance of social science work. But again, within the social sciences, there's also ways in which I've had colleagues who are physicians, for instance, who who are very interested in data and other things, who will say, "Oh, let's just get an economist on board." It's almost as if the other social sciences don't exist. So there is the economists are about efficiency. They will give them a set of priorities which is different. So even within the social sciences, we should not neglect the fact of psychology. I find some of the interventions that some of my colleagues do through social psychology, clinical psychology, when they do these massive studies, for instance, in mental health, and treatment and access for mental health drugs, for instance. There's almost no need to understand context, to understand language, to understand cultures. So I think even across the social sciences, before blaming the biomedical sciences, we should have an equal kind of response and a kind of level playing field amongst each other. And biomedicine itself, I think, has taken very widely from the social sciences, but it's a very difficult enterprise. But I think so many centers have shown that it's something that can be done. It comes out of the power of resources. Economists have access to policy advice. Biomedical institutions often have certain kinds of research funding, and certain fields are not seen as offering one number, one policy, one advice. Demography, for instance, demographers have offered so much flawed advice over time in terms of fertility predictions, in terms of population control, including economists. People like Jeffrey Sachs have tanked entire East European countries. But we don't hold them accountable for the kinds of mistakes they've made. So I'm raising a second kind of point, that it is difficult, but I think interdisciplinary work can only happen with very small steps and in a very gradual way, but it has to come with a huge amount of mutual respect, I think.
Can I add to that, Ritu?
Yes, Nandi.
Just taking this dialogue forward, because I think it's very important, this so-called conflict. I mean, we have experienced it in our own growth, because when we came in, we were seen as doctors, misplaced doctors, in a very esoteric theoretical environment. And there were people in the school who thought that we are going to pollute sociology, and they were worried about our competencies. So we had two levels of conflicts. We had disagreements within ourselves, and we had to understand each other, and we had to deal with the larger body. But still, I think it was a beautiful experience because I, as a physician, learned that we consider ourselves the objective sciences, and social sciences were supposed to be the subjective sciences. And we are objective because we have to study the germ as a cause, and we don't see any other cause for disease that now have changed. But this notion of the objectivity of biomedicine is highly questionable. And what is beautiful about social sciences is that when human beings study human beings, then it's clear that there are biases. And those biases reflect your positioning, your understanding, your ideology. And therefore, social sciences taught me as a physician the importance of respecting your own bias, of fighting for your own biases. So while there are conflicts, there are also very positive experiences of learning from each other across these wide ranging disciplines. And that's what I would like to add.
Thank you. I think we can see it in the work of both the speakers and much here. So there's certainly hope for that kind of interdisciplinarity. Maybe this is the last question I will take. Amitabh's question, Amitabh, I'll just read it out. It's a question to Kavita. Regarding the point of the human body, would you please explain and expand whether it's capital accumulation of labor or capital accumulation of bodies? This based distinction might help us to understand where the development paradigm went wrong. Would you like to take that on?
Sure, sure. I mean, I'm happy to talk more in detail, but when I'm talking about the body as a kind of capital, but it's really an accumulation of capital to offer labor. And it becomes a site also to understand how the body can be compromised or not from disease. And therefore, how does it become an efficient kind of conduit for offering labor for various kinds of capitalist enterprise, whether it's in plantations. When you carry coolie labor, for instance, from India to Sri Lanka, you are constantly, they were measuring the health capital of and adaptation of this labor force, or whether it's in factories, or currently when we try to evaluate who's immune or not immune based on their capacity for labor capital, based on the kinds of risks certain constituencies represent. So, for instance, there were a lot of biases about, the Punjabi labor, who offers a certain kind of capital because they are wheat eating. They have a different nutrition pattern versus South Indian labor. So it's interesting how these kinds of tropes of labor and capital were linked basically to try and understand what kinds of efficiency or productivity could be linked. And immunity itself and capital was linked to that. And, if you survived a certain disease, for instance, Catherine Oliverius's work shows that if you survived the yellow fever in New Orleans in the late 19th century, then if you were a white person, then actually your capital increased because you would not die and you were likely to be able to reach higher ranks. But if you survived yellow fever as an African American, your capital increased too, but you wouldn't go up vertically. You would just be more useful in a plantation. So there are limits to how much your labor and capital can take you based on your own subordination and social antecedents.
Thanks, Kavita. Dr. Antony Kolanur and Suhas Kolikar are just reminding us that when we talk the discussion on private sector and its role, please differentiate between the private for-profit and the private not-for-profit, and the big corporate houses from the small doctor-owned hospitals. The point I think, Kavita, that you made and they also made about the differences and the regulatory structures and therefore what they mean for each of these. So these are more as comments. Dr. Antony Kolanur's other point is about saying that don't you think that when we are talking of expanding boundaries, we need to make clear delineation between priorities of marginalized people and their health versus the entire spectrum of health of entire population of a country. That is a meaningful choice. Let the corporate and private sector have their own modus operandi. Don't waste energy on converting them to deliver services to the poor. Least on a switch over from care to over cures. The government must concentrate on public health system, which is meant for the less privileged and middle class. Dr. Antony, I just thought I'd read it out for sake of time.
It's fine.
I've just read out exactly what you wrote. I hope that's. If you want to add anything, please.
No. What's your comment?
Kavita, would you like to restate some of what you have? Because this is,
I just wanted to say one point. The academicians is bound to explain the whole narrative. They don't make choices. They have to cover the entire spectrum. So also the government may have to do, but it's a purposeful choice to concentrate as public health activists on the less privileged. That's my point. And I'm asking them, do you agree?
Professor Kolanur, if I may respond to this, I mean, what I was trying to show was that, we are all the time pleading with the government and we are saying what the government ought to do. But what I have tried to argue is that the government is not interested in those things. These window dressings are only for the last point, social determinants. We will look through intersectoral health in your 5-year plans. So the point is that let us be very clear. One, that we are trying to generate a new understanding of the complexity that is public health. And then our second challenge is that once we know that the poverty and the problem of the 65 to 70% of the people in this country ought to be addressed, then we have to develop our strategies. One of the things which has come up very clearly, that even the kind of academics that you do, the problem perception and the solution, cannot be successful unless and until right from the beginning, from research, you involve people and how they perceive their problems and what their needs are. And then our function is to put this forward. For that, we have to organize ourselves in small sectors, like, you know, even within hospitals. It's the manager who decides what the priorities are. And the priority is how much profit the hospital makes, not the patient. So you fight that. In the community health center, you have another set of problems. Everyone, I mean, you give 80,000 rupees per year for the health center, and that is supposed to do integrated public health, and you have no referral system. So they all go to the private sector. So there is enough to find where to intervene. And it's not only the people who are in the movements, whether it's the health movement, the farmer movement, the students who are fighting for needs. We need to link up everywhere. You know, we have a huge task. So for the time being, I am just containing myself as to how I understand. Once I understand, then I'm sure Ritu will organize something to say, how do we act upon it?
Thank you.
Okay. I think we are now at a point, both in terms of time, we're getting to 8 o'clock.
I thought we were to end at 7:30.
Yes, that's. I think there were a whole host of interesting questions and discussion that we had, so we went on. But we'll close now. Amitabh has an issue about causality, the question you asked about from his study of epidemiology. Amitabh, I think we'll leave that for another time, if that's okay with you. That's a whole discussion in itself separately.
Yeah,
so
sure.
maybe, in fact, it brings me to first announcing the next webinar that we are going to have, which is epidemiology and the social sciences. That's on the 26th at 5:30. We note it's 5:30 and not 5 p.m. like today. On the 26th, that's next Friday.
Will you be sending a link and everything for that also?
Yes, so we'll be sending the announcement. Yeah, we will, certainly. We will. Okay, so that brings me to my final duty of thanking people who have been involved in all the effort, and the participants, most of all, for being there and listening and participating and adding with their questions and queries. But let me first begin by thanking Professor Anand Krishnan for agreeing to be part of conceptualizing and organizing this particular webinar. On behalf of myself, of course, but also of the whole organizing committee of the center, which is Professor Rama Baru, Rajiv Das Gupta, Ramila Bisht, and Prachin Godachkar. And on behalf of all of them, including Professor Krishnan, I have to express my thanks to the speakers, to Dr. Imrana Kadir, to Kavita Shivaramakrishnan, and to Professor Mulyal, who very spontaneously agreed to chairing this session. And it's been such a privilege to have him there and give his blessings to this. While we had the discussants highlighting the issues, both Arima Mishra and Anand Krishnan, my thanks to them as well. And finally, to the those who helped in organizing the event today, the AIMS team and those at JNU. I'll just quickly name some of the ones who gave very specific inputs. Pratibha Pittu and Shivangi Shankar created the poster for us. Manmohan, who has been sending out all the announcements and information. Indranil for linking and hosting this platform. And my organizing committee colleague, especially Rajiv Dasgupta, for providing backup. I'm sure there are others I've left out, but I'll just make apologies to them and say thanks to everyone. Thank you. I think we now all need to, in the Indian situation, go for our dinner and you for your breakfast, Kavita. So thank you. Thank you, everyone. Namaskar.
Thank you very much, Ritu.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone. And thank you, Professor Kadir.
Thank you. It's nice to see you.
Nice to meet you too.
And thanks to Professor Mulyal.
Yes, especially thanks.
Yes.
Yes, it's a pleasure to have him. Okay.
Thank you, Ritu.